Part 2 in our mini-series. Today we're going to look at the frame and how we got this all together. That sounds good? Stick around. Welcome back. So our top is now trimmed down to that size we spoke about in the last video. Everything's flat, it's smooth, the holes are all filled. We're ready to build this frame. I'm nervous about this frame because I've never worked with this stuff before, and it's not that so much, but it's the cutting of it, and we'll talk about how I'm going to cut it, and then you'll probably share my nervousness and fear when you see the technique I'm going to use. So this could go wrong big time, or it could work incredibly well. But let's start off by weighing things up. So I've got these 4 feet that's going to screw into the underside of the table. This is the underside, obviously the top is face down at the moment, and we'll have 4 of those in the corners like that. And I've decided I'm going to set these 10mm in, so 10mm in from the end and 10mm in from the edge as well. What I then have is a number of legs that quite happily slide into there, and these are tightened up using a 6mm driver. And then I have these knuckle joints that will simply slide down the legs to a position, and I've no idea what that is yet. We need to think about that. And obviously one of those on each legs, and then a crossbar that connects those together, and a small crossbar that comes in here. That's it. The frame is really that simple. And once I've worked out the sizes of these, and I've cut them down to size, the frame is pretty simple. So job 1, I'm going to lay out these connection pieces here, and we know I want these to be 10mm in from the edge, so we'll just mark a 10mm reference corner. So that's where they're going to go, so that was super easy. Now the reason I put these here is I want to take the measurements from here, from this point. Even though these knuckle joints in the bottom shelf will be further up here somewhere, I always take the measurements close to the board. And if you do that, then your legs will always be squared and parallel to the board, because that's a fixed position. So with that lined up, it's now simply a case of measuring from here to here, here to here, here to here, and here to here, and that should give me consistent measurements. So I'm actually going to use my wooden rule for this measurement, because I can simply lie it on top like that, and now I can line that up with that shoulder, and I can look at this shoulder, and I've got a measurement of 105.9, and my width here from that shoulder to that shoulder is 130. Now interestingly, the overall length of these, coming from the manufacturer, is 106. So I'm looking for 105.9, and these are already at 160. So the cross pieces I don't have to cut. Yes, a result. So they can go straight in as they are. Perfect. Now the second thing I need to know about is the overall size of the table. Thinking 900, which will make it the same size or the same height as this bench here, which is quite a nice height, and you could think about that with ornaments on it for your plants. That'd be quite a nice height, and because it's a 1.2 overall, I think aesthetically that would look pretty good as well. So let's work out how big this thing needs to be. So I'm going to bolt a leg into position like so, and 900 is going to take me to that point there. So I now need to cut 4 pieces, whatever that length is, and that would be pretty good. Now that measurement is 864, so we're going to cut them all at 865, I think. Let's talk about how we're going to cut this. Now I've thought about a number of things. I thought about cutting them on the Capex and getting a metal blade. Problem is I can't get a metal blade for this. I can get a non-ferrous metal blade, which is good for aluminium, but I can't get one that's going to cut this mild steel. And if I was to cut that, cut this with the wrong blade, those little sparks that are going to come out are going to be hot, and it's just going to damage the back of the sword and probably the internals, so I don't really want to do that. The obvious answer is I use a hacksaw, but I can't be bothered. But that could be the fallback position. If the other idea I've got doesn't work, then we'll use a fallback position of cutting these by hand and a hacksaw blade. An angle grinder would work. I don't have an angle grinder, and I don't really want to buy one unless I am forced to, so I don't have an angle grinder, but an angle grinder will be great. But the angle grinder, I think as well, will generate a lot of heat, and with this being powder coated, I can just see it damaging a little bit. It's probably not a problem because all these are going inside some sort of knuckle joint, so it's probably not an issue for us, but just bear that in mind. So I'm actually going to try and cut these on my bandsaw. I know. My bandsaw is a woodworking bandsaw. Now you can get a version of the bandsaw that I've got that has a variable speed driver on it, and that is rated to cut through mild steel. So I know that horsepower wise it's big enough to do the job. I've done a load of research and I've seen people are cutting metal on bandsaws, but there's some big precautions that you have to take, and we are going to take each and every one of those precautions. The first one is the blade. Now the blade that's in my bandsaw today is obviously a wood cutting blade. I have two. I have a rip and I have a very, very fine precision blade inside there as well. Neither of those are going to do the job. I did some research and I came across a company called Tuff, T-U-F-F, and I'll leave a link here, and I've no association with these guys whatsoever. Now they do make bandsaw blades for all types of bandsaws, including metal cutting bandsaws. And they do a service where they will make a custom blade for any size bandsaw. So I got them to make me a metal cutting blade for the right length for the bandsaw that I'm going to use. So that's job one. I'm using the right type of blade on a bandsaw. The second thing I want to do is to clean down the bandsaw. I use it for wood, and if you ever saw the review that I did on that bandsaw, it's not the best extraction in the world even by bandsaw standards, so it's got dust inside it, and obviously as that blade spins in, it's going to disturb that dust. It's going to give me gorgeous dust in the air. The last thing I want to do is to then send a sharp metal red hot object into that dust cloud, because that can end in tears, I think. So we're not going to do that. We're going to clean the bandsaw down. I'm also strangely not going to use dust extraction. Again, the dust extraction I've got built into the shop is aimed at woodworking tools, and once again it's full of dust, as is the collector itself and as is the bag that does all the collecting. Because I've just been sanding those tops down, it's a gorgeous fine dust that's just waiting to be ignited. So I'm not going to use dust extraction on this one. I'm also going to make sure that I've got safety glasses on. I'm also going to make sure that I've got hair protection on, and I'm also just put a light hat on just in case anything splashes back onto my gorgeous mane of hair. I'm also going to use my Incra mitre gauge to give me a 90-degree cut, and also to give me something to hold that pipe onto. I don't fancy it twisting inside the cut. I don't think that would help us in any way, shape or form. And if you do decide to do this, you're doing this at your own risk. I'm not recommending this technique. I don't know if this technique is going to work. It could be the daftest idea I've had in 1,000 years. We do not know until we try. So I'm not recommending this. And if you do this, you're doing it at your own risk. So, the moment of truth. I've dropped the blade in, and I've retensioned it. I've slowed the speed down to the slowest speed I can get on here, which is 600 meters per minute from memory. Hearing protection, eye protection, Woodgrafter branded hat available at the store, www.thewoodgrafter.com, if you want to get yourself one. And that's as much as I can do. Let's give it a go now. And would you believe it? Just look at this cut. It went through beautifully. It went through a knife like butter. No drama, no hassle. Quite a few sparks that we expected to get, but we cleaned the machine down, so we're relatively safe. And it's gorgeous. And that wasn't frightening in any way, shape or form. So there you go. Cutting mild steel on a woodworking bandsaw. And it worked, and it worked. So I'm going to get all these cut down to size now. And I'm gobsmacked. I just didn't really expect that to work. I thought I was going to be messing around with a hacksaw and what have you. So the next job is to lay out the frame. Now we know that these sort of stick on the corners here 10 millimeters in from either edge. So I just want to put those into their final position, and then I can use these as anchor points as I build up the frame to make sure everything stays square. Now job one is I want to make sure I'm working on the right side of the board. This is the top. So logic dictates this is the bottom. And it's important that I put these in the right position. So what I've done, I've just created a very simple location template on the 3D printer. The hole is an interference fit to these flanges, and it's just got a couple of reference fences on it, both 10mm in from the edge of the hole. So when I put that there, then that's the exact position I want these flanges to be in. Now these flanges will have an orientation that's important in our final layout, and you can see that they've got a grub screw just here on the flange. So that means that when I insert the leg, this is just an offcut, and tighten that thing in, it obviously pushes the leg to this back face. So you can see it's not a big gap, but there's a slight gap here against this face here, because the grub screw is obviously pushing the pipe back. And when you look at the knuckle joint, the thing that's going to be on the frame, it's got the same idea. There's a grub screw that's going to push the pipe back against this face. So I want, in our final assembly, those two grub screws to line up. If this one was the other way around, you can see it would twist that leg, and that's enough offset where that would just take that leg out of kilter, and therefore the frame wouldn't be square. So when I orientate this, it's important that that grub screw is in the same orientation as the knuckle joint. Now the good thing about this is that the grub screw on all these flanges is directly between two of the mounting holes, so 45 degrees between the two mounting holes. And what I put on my template is 4 reference marks that will line up with those mounting holes. So in theory, if I mount my flange in my template like so, with these holes lining up against the reference points, that is now 45 degrees, just exactly the position I want it to be in, so I can just go ahead and mark the position of those holes. All the weight on this is going to be pushing down onto this flange, so it doesn't need a lot of lateral support, it just needs to be held into position. Therefore I'm going to use these wonderful furniture clips, and these are the ones that you drill a hole, you put those in, these little pins grip into the wood, and then it's got a threaded hole inside. In this case it's an M5, and then I can just bolt this into position. Now 6.5mm drill bit should give me a nice tight fit on side here. Now be careful when you're doing this. First of all, check you're on the right side of the board, you're working on the underside. Go into those holes, into the centres that you've just made, and take your time. Keep your drill as square as you can. Drill down to the red tape and stop. Next step is I now want to build that underframe, the frame that's going to support the lower shelf. And if you remember what we said before, I want to take the dimensions from these fixed mounting points. That way when I bring it up on the frame, it brings the frame square. I'm going to loose assemble that frame first of all. And then I'm going to just lift it into position and try and rest it onto those mounting points that we've just made. And I've not tightened this up, so it's all over the show, but don't worry about that. I then want to take some offcuts of the leg, not the actual legs themselves, because we are going to mark these horrendously. I'm going to drop them in like so. Now once we get these knuckles locked in, we know they're always going to line up with these brackets because they're sat on top of them. So even when I raise this up, they'll still be in the same position, reference to those anchor points. Long pieces and the short pieces are still loose. So now I'm just going to make sure that that's sort of kind of middle-ish, not bothered. And I'm just going to lock those down as well. There you go. So now we know that the frame that's going to be raised up is perfectly lined up with the mounting points. So we can drop it off at that point. Awesome. The next job is I want to look at the shelf that's going to go on here. So aesthetically, what I'm looking for is something like that. So you can actually see the front of this frame here. Next job is I need to allow for those legs. I'm going to turn it so the top is facing down. And I'm going to put this on in that orientation so you can see everything is lining up. And I want to center this onto this board and then make sure it's square across this board as well. So I've eyeballed this edge here to make sure it's centre point of this opening, and I've done the same here to make sure that this is centre point of the opening. I'm now checking these pieces here, and it is looking like everything is now evenly distributed just by eyeballing into these holes. And I just used a set square to make sure that the offset here and the offset here are the same, and they are. Now, taking a pencil, I'm just going to trace the inside of those holes. Now, if I had a 34mm hole cutter, I guess I could jury rig another piece of wood at this side here and then just drill those out, and that's probably the quickest way. So what I'm going to do, I think, I'm going to use a handsaw to cut down close to this line, and then a sharp chisel to get rid of the waste, and then I'll come in with a bobbin sander and I'll just finish this profile off using my bobbin sander. I think that's the best chance that I've got here. Now, what I've ended up with on all 4 of those markings that we made where the legs are going to go is a series of cuts that go right through the wood and come down and approach, but do not quite touch the line. Now, the grain is running in this direction here, so these will chip out incredibly easy now with a good sharp chisel. This is a 20mm chisel, small handy hammer. Now, these cuts will stop your chisel running out. I'm not sure if you can see, but just here I've completed that cut, that my line curves around here. So if I was to chisel on that piece there now, the wood's going to split off down here and I'll probably lose this corner. So now I want to make sure that I'm cutting on this side of that cut to stop that happening. So don't come back into the line now, you're sliding your chisel over and making sure you're into that cut. As you come into this part here, your 20mm chisel is probably going to be too big. So now I'm going to step down to a 10mm chisel and just get as close as I can to the bottom of those cuts. And there you go, you have the makings of your hole. So you can now see a bit of sanding will bring that down to the right shape. So there we go, a bit of sanding, bit of work, bit of effort. That now fits quite nicely and it's looking pretty good. And once all these back legs, these are only scrap bits of metal, but once the back legs are in, that's going to look really, really quite good down there on the floor, I think. So the next job is to just bring all these down now to their final sanding. Remember, the drum sander finished off at 180 from memory, so I'm just going to take this up to about 220 using the Festool hand sander. I'll also break off these arises, these sharp bits on the edge of the wood, both top and bottom. I'm not going to do a round over on this one, I'm just going to hand sand that. I want a small bit of imperfection on that edge, and that all just adds and suggests back to that urban look, that industrial theme that this is based on. Will be a nice contrast. You don't want it to be too perfect, but obviously you want it to be good. So I'll do that. We'll get it sanded down and get the arises broken off, and then it's a matter of getting the oil on these, so we'll come back when we're ready to do that finish, I think. So we've sanded it down, we've cleaned it up, we've raised the grain, we've knocked the grain down. I've got my gloves on, which can only mean it's time to put the final finish on this thing. I'm using a boiled linseed oil finish on this one. Now, this is commercially available, boiled linseed oil. I've not made this myself and boiled it. So actually, this boiled linseed oil isn't actually boiled. But what it does have inside it are some additives, which means it goes off a lot quicker, it dries a lot quicker than true boiled linseed oil. It gives you a beautiful finish, but yeah, it goes off quicker than boiled linseed oil. Has some downsides to it. It is volatile because it's got those chemicals in to help it to dry quicker. So you need to be careful how you treat your rags. Don't screw them up and put them in the bin, because they will probably catch fire and cause some issues. So you need to ideally finish with the rags and burn the rags if you can do that. What I tend to do is lie them flat on a concrete surface and I let the oil naturally dry out on the rags, and then I can dispose of them safely. Simple technique. I've got the oil, I've got a container to put the oil in, I've got a couple of rags, one to apply and one to remove. And you'll notice here, I've just put some of these bench dogs paint pyramids here in the background, and I'm going to work on the small piece first. I'll do the underside of it, and then I can rest the underside on there, and then I can do the top, the edges and the ends, and then I can just leave that in position there to naturally dry out, because the air can circulate underneath as well. And then we'll do the larger one. Awesome. I always love the smell of linseed oil. It reminds me of my granddad's cricket bat when I was a kid growing up. Spent a lot of time with my granddad. Yeah, one of the guys that got me into making things actually. So yeah, it's got happy boyhood memories. Liberal amount on your cloth, and just sit it on that surface and just rub it in with circular motions. Then wipe it down in the direction of the grain. First coat does soak in quite a lot, so we are going to aim for 2 coats minimum on this job, and we're going to allow it to dry out between coats. So the job does slow down a little bit at this juncture. Just doing the edge as well. It's going to go towards the back, and don't forget the end grain. Now that's good. So I'm just going to take the dry rag now to clean. I'm just going to lightly pull that down, and all that's doing is just removing any of that soaking that's likely to pool. And don't forget the edge. Okay, there you go. 2 coats of linseed oil later, and a nice period to dry. This is about 4 to 8 hours. And your tops are good. And the tactile feel of this is beautiful. Right, so we are now ready to get this thing assembled. I'm going to build it up on the bench, so I'm going to turn over the top, and then we'll start to construct the framework. Before I do that, I want to just create this sub-assembly here, which is a lower shelf and a lower shelf bracket. So that's what I'm going to do first. Going to come in with my sub-assembly, and we know that just rests on there. And just note, I've got these grub screws facing up, so eventually they'll face down on the floor. Just means the shelf is slightly closer to the frame. Just bringing those offcuts in again so I can get this thing lined up. A couple of appropriately sized pipe clips. I just went for these stainless steel clips with the rubber guard on it, and these are 34 millimeters. Pipe's 34 mil. So I want the surface of this assembly, i.e. the top of the shelf, to be 700 from the top of the table. So just using a little piece of chalk, I just want to mark 700, which is there. So from the top of the flanges that I can use as a reference point, that's going to be 620. So if I cut 4 pieces of wood 620 long, I can just clamp them to this leg, drop the top assembly on till the top rests on the supports, and tighten it down, and it should all be good to go. So in theory, I can now take the lower assembly, make sure I've got the front. This is the front of the lower assembly, and this is the front of the upper assembly. Orientate it correctly and slide it onto these stops, and we should be in good shape. Let's see what happens. Well, apart from the view of my bum, that probably wasn't too bad. Just want to check my height, make sure I am where I want it to be. Looks good. Tighten it into place. Now obviously these are cut, and this is going to go on a wooden floor actually from memory, and obviously that's going to scratch it. So going back to one of the best woodworking tools in the world, 3D printer, I've just printed out some little rubber feet, and if I'm right, these should slot nicely into these legs. So that's it, we have a console table. Really like this, I like the way it's come out. I love these black powder coated legs and the contrast between that sort of polished oak laminated tops and the shelves here that we've got. I love the fact we've retained that sort of urban industrial look with these big knuckle joints and those really bold grub screws that hold it all together. I love the fact it's clamped itself square, really secure, and that technique of making this bottom assembly but sized off these fixed points here. I've just pulled everything into squareness, which is absolutely beautiful to see. So I'm really pleased about it. I think it looks really nice, and all the 3D printed feet have all come out well too, blending it all together and protecting the floor. So I'm going to get this off to its final resting place. Hope the person who's going to receive it is pleased. I'm sure they will be. I think it's hit the brief incredibly well. And I'll see you next time on the Woodgrafter, and God knows what we're going to do, but I'll see you then. Take care.